Thank you very much for listening to this talk that we're going to board this topic of towards a new architectural interpretation system and the sensory experience. And as you know, after frequent interactions between ANFA attending architects, we perceive an impetus for using neuroscience as a tool to understand the brain and its perception of space. Confusion is still there, and there is a relationship between neuroscience and architecture that we need to avoid because the dialogue is still dissenting. So architects want to understand the methodologies and strategies to solve design and architectural problems based on neuroscience to provide the optimal architectural experience. However, this understanding on the subject seldom aligns with the objectives and solutions that architects seek. So I'd like to start with this idea of perception. And we know, and you already heard of this, the perception and perceiving interest of neuroscience, it is recognizing a thing or an experience through a process initiated by the senses. New architecture focuses on the Gestalt theory of perception and cognitive psychology, but we are trying to understand the principles of neural structure formation in the context of architecture. For the Gestalt, the human being organizes this perception as totalities, as form or configuration, and not as a single sum of its parts. Hence, what is perceived goes from being a set of spots to becoming people, objects, and scenes. And of course, this information comes from people that I really admire, and you can see the sources: Eric Jensen, Johanny Palasma, Harry Francis Malgrave, and John P. Ebenhardt. So neurosciences focuses at a cellular level, and architecture analyzes user response to cognitive psychology. So we as architects are aiming to simplify a system that will allow us to understand neuroscience and the effects of architecture and human behavior, where the interpretation and manifestation of spatial perception is also subject to personal or collective memory through a regulated architecture composition. So if I show you this image, and you will see there is a rectangle here, the first idea is just a simple bidimensional drawing, something that doesn't give me a lot of information. But as soon as I start applying some lines to this, it could become a three-dimensional space. So our brain is wired to try to understand from the two-dimensional to the three-dimensional way. So in a matter, I'm just showing a sketch, and here you can understand that there is a space. So what it was before a rectangle now becomes a door, or perhaps a space that we can go through this just simple sketching. So we need to understand, before this going a little bit deep, what is the theory of optimal level of arousal? And I will go through this a little bit further in my presentation. We continually regulate our levels of arousal with various mechanisms and means of stimulations. For instance, economists know how to tell us what people are willing to pay and for how much, but hardly ever know why. This is Robert Giggs and John Dodson. So how does stimulation affect our welfare state? So we need to recognize these 5 factors: pleasure, security, belonging, self-esteem and empathy, and the need to update. So if we go back to this idea of the physiological, the basic needs and pleasure, we understand the hedonic, everything that stimulates or excites or gives us pleasure. So the first one could be the physiological, and that gives us a negative hedonic tone, which manifests in hungry, thirst, psychological needs. But we also understand the positive hedonic tones, which is only the purpose to feel good. For instance, architecture covering the basic needs about hungry, thirst, physiological needs is always there. So we just need to go there and satisfy our basic needs, and then we're done, we're happy. But we're always looking for this architecture that is also covering our sensual experience just for the sake of it, just for the only purpose to feel good, just for pleasure. And the second one, we talk about social and what brings architecture and how we understand architecture that stimulates coexistence, something that gives us security and belonging, but also the part that is intellectual, the updated needs of self-esteem and empathy. So there is an architecture that can stimulate community values and human interaction. So the formulation from neuroscience to architecture becomes from 3 factors of perception. One, that is the observation. The second one, that is the exposition. And the third one, that is the stimulation. So we go through all these in a second. Observation means there is a cognitive process, something that we understand, something that relates to what we already lived, something that was in the past or that we recognize as soon as we enter to a space. And also, what is this cognitive process, what we already understand as architecture of a space, can give us a hint on how to behave in a space. So for instance, if I enter to a church, the first reaction I might have is to be quiet, to stay focused on what's in front of me. And there must be a coherence and complexity, something that also gives me this sense of peacefulness, this sense of admiration, this sense of awe, this idea of feeling overwhelmed by the space. The exposition means something that I can interpret, something that is ready to read. The ideologies and conventions, semantics, and semiotics. For instance, if I see a building that has this red cross on top, I immediately understand that this symbol is giving me some meaning, is giving me the language of what is inside this building, that perhaps is a hospital or is a medical facility. And the stimulation, so the third one, and this is an important factor, is how architecture can stimulate us and go through the suggestions or invite us to navigate this stimuli of navigation, or even the shapes of buildings that can provoke or generate this idea of motion or dynamics versus the static. So for this research that I'm doing, I came up with these 4 constructs. And this is what I call the new architectural interpretation system, or a hermeneutic process. What I mean is this investigation just aims to develop a descriptive system for neuroarchitectural interpretations and architectural design strategies. So it can function as a meticulous chart of tools supported by the neuroscientific information and architecture theory, while using a methodology for encompassing a hermeneutic process, that means the interpretation process, based on 4 conceptual constructs. And these conceptual constructs are the semiotics, the gestalt or formal, the dynamics, and the cognitive. And we'll go through this. So when I'm talking about semiotics, it's everything that gives me some meaning. There are symbols that gives me meaning of things. And they also are connected to ideologies and conventions. For instance, as well, the psychology of color, or any symbol that in architecture is giving me a meaning or a significance. So you can see this image on the left. You can see already there are some shapes. However, there are no shapes at all. You are completing the shape of a triangle, or even the shapes of the squares. But somehow your brain is wired to give you some interpretation that you already try to recognize in what you've seen there. So I like to show some examples. For instance, when we talk about the work of Luis Barragán and in the Jardines del Pedregal, and how he took this idea or this memory, and it's a translation of what he already see before on the Ferdinand Bach Les Colombiers. As you can remember, Luis Barragán is a Mexican architect that was very influenced for this particular architect, Ferdinand Bach. When he went to Europe, he somehow took all this memory and tried to bring together to what later he designed as one of the most important or famous buildings or gardens and landscape in Mexico City. So somehow you can see this relationship between the 2 images, one that is the original and the one that is the interpretation that Luis Barragán developed through the memory of what he already felt or the experience that he had when he was in France. And then there's another example, and I really want to talk about Luis Barragán since he's from the same city where I am, and well, he passed away like 20 years ago, but he is one of the architects that won the Pritzker Prize. And you can see here in these spaces that there is another interpretation from the Mexican hacienda, from these spaces that were in a ranch, but in a very contemporary way, or translated to a new way of understanding architecture. But the symbols and everything that is from the memory, from what he remembers as feeling great or feeling cozy or feeling at home, it is interpreted in a new architecture, in a contemporary architecture. The same happened with Rafael Moneo in a work that we can see this idea of taking elements from the past and reusing it to make a new space, but always with the idea of creating this sense of grandiosity and also monumentality. So there is a strong relationship between what he sees as a space for contemplation, for the art, but also to the relationship of a cathedral. So for instance, we can see these shapes or these forms that are a new interpretation for what architecture could be and what it means and what can it simulate. So somehow the sensory premises that I value on this investigation, and there are a lot of more, but we're just focusing on a few of them so I can show you this information. So let's think about silence in space through light and contemplation. Material changes generate attention and search for balance. There are factors that generate constant attentions through the haptic system. And there are plenty of them that I've been analyzing and how we can apply these premises to design, and then what is a stimuli that provoke that happen in our brain. The second construct is the gestalt, and that means that architectural production systems, and this is something that we discussed a little bit later as well. That means that we can create scenarios and sets, visual frames, panoramic, and landscape. So for instance, when I see, and when we talk about gestalt, we always talk about the theory of form and what it means, not just one particular object, but what it means in the context and what it means for the whole purpose of what we're seeing. So as you can see the image on the left, on the right, you can see that there is a cylinder inside of a cubic shape. And you can see here this interpretation. What I'm really interested on this is of the idea of inside and outside. When you are inside the space and you're really inside because you are through a glass partition that you can see towards the outside. And we can see it in this example, who's being observed or who's observing. Now, in this case, I can feel inside the glass box that I'm the observer, that I'm observing towards the outside. But what happened when I'm outside? Am I being observed or am I being the observer? So these ideas still make some tension of what are our feelings towards a space that is covered by glass wall instead of a solid wall. So there's this essay on the theater of effects from Mies van der Rohe, and this idea of interpreting what we can see from the outside and how we can see the inside. And what is the perception that changes as soon as we are in or out of a space, just through the simple plane of a wall, of a glass wall. Friedrich Schinkel does another interpretation on this when he suggested, for instance, the overlaying or the juxtaposition of frames and the complexity that this idea generates. So somehow what happens with our brain and with our eyes and the retina is excited as soon as we see some shapes that are not in the same plane, but in different positions. So we play with this arousal of the eyes and the shadows and the lights that can generate but also as soon as we move. For instance, this idea of the parallax composition and what happened to our brain when we move from one point to the other. When we talk about parallax, there is an object that is at the end, and that is solid, that is staying there. But as soon as we move, the other objects move as well, and then we lose the sight of that object that was at the end. So somehow this reaction and make us to feel good around something that we can admire from different angles. So this was the idea of Schinkel when he designed the Altes Museum. When you are staying in one point through the perspective, you can see at the end something, but as soon as you move, you start framing other views towards the city of Berlin. In the case of the picturesque, which was developed, this theory that applies to landscape from Sir Yvedal Price and Richard Payne Knight, what we've seen here, and as the name mentioned, the picturesque, it means that we can see something in a frame, like a perfect picture, a perfect painting. It's something that can be look natural, that can be in a natural landscape, but is intervened by the man. So there is some hand over there. So at the end, we have a specific point that is static, that is the foreground, the last part that we can see. The horizon plays a huge role here. So we can see at the end an object. But before we see that object, we see different layers, and the composition becomes like a frame. So everything is framed to look towards the end. So we don't move, so we remain static. This idea gives us a grandeur or ecstasy just to see or to admire this. So this is when we talk to, or we mention something is very picturesque or it remains in the painting. And I like to show you this example of Aug20, who does this interpretation of understanding the different framings. So what he does in the house is you can stay in one point and looking towards the walls and these partitions and these openings, you see different entrance of light, but everything is focused to remain framed, to remain in layers. So this composition makes the brain to stay static towards one point of view. And you can see here in this video, what I'm trying to interpret with this is, at the end, what we want to do is trying to understand what happened in between the last object that I'm viewing, and how I can make this movement towards that specific point, since I have different layers, different ways of entering the light, perhaps sound and smell. So this opens my curiosity towards the object and seeing through a frame. The same within Othon, through different sensory premises, like the psychology of inside and outside space, movement derived from stillness, framing the specific, a landscape and nature, and sounds and haptic. The third construct that I would like to show is the dynamics, or an architecture and movement. This is, we're talking about orientation, wayfinding, navigation, movement, balance, cinematic, and parallax. And of course, the perspective. This image shows the work of the function of the oblique, the theory of the function of the oblique from Paul Virillo and Claude Parent. And what they were trying to say, there's no walls or partitions that are perpendicular or 90 degrees angles towards the floor. Everything is tilted, or everything is in a surface like ramps. So this allows people, or at least generates a stimulus to be moved. So this generates a movement and dynamics. And the same happened in this project from Foreign Office Architects at the ferry terminal in Yokohama, as you can see. And this is a very interesting example, because in this example, you can see that people cannot be standing for long hours in a specific space. So people need to be moving. And this is very related to the purpose or the function of the building, which is just a transitional building, is a ferry terminal. So somehow this idea of not having the walls 90 degrees angles or perpendicular to the floor allows you to think on movement, on the dynamics, on motion. So you constantly feel that you need to keep the motion. So this becomes to the interpretation of the haptics and the proprioception to move towards a specific goal or the specific point. So in this sense, we can understand that as soon as we tilt it, or as soon as we move buildings, or we create some shapes that are not perpendicular or specific, or making some visual constraint, we are trying to make people move in space through the motion of the walls. And the same happened with the Armani store in this design of the staircase from Massimiliano Fuchsas. And as you can see here, there's always a different views that allows you to find, or the curiosity to move around, but you cannot stay there for longer a period of time. The same happened with the work of Richard Serra. And this is an interpretation very interesting, because Richard Serra, what he does is that you can move inside these spaces, inside the surfaces, but as soon as you move, you're always tilting towards the side of the wall, in the same position that the wall is coming. So somehow it can create some vertigo. And you can see in the spaces, these are ways or strategies of using architecture that can cause different effects on the haptics, on the way we see the space, on the way we touch the space, and how we even feel equilibrium. And if we can walk inside these spaces and can feel the movement of these elements, then we might be just moving towards the same angle as the walls that are surrounding us. So there's, with these sensory premise, we talk about sense of movement, vertigo, tension between walls, the oblique function, and angular tension. Finally, it is the cognitive. And when we talk about the cognitive, it's everything that we already recognize that can provoke some suggestion. So there is a sensory experience, there's a stimulation and suggestion, and there's a reflection and contemplation. So here I'd like to talk a little bit about the Kaplan and Kaplan theory of preference that talks about complexity, coherence, readability of mystery. In this image, you can see, for instance, how the building of Louis Kahne's Salk Institute provokes you to walk towards the end. Although you know that at the end there's a wall, you perhaps want to explore because there's this mystery between what the light is coming and from where the light is coming from. So you want to explore, even smell what's going on in the right or on the left side. So you can see as well that what we can apply for these strategies is mystery, how we make people to walk towards a specific goal or to find out what's going on within the walls of architecture. So how we just awaken our curiosity just for the sake of not missing anything in the space. So these are some of the theories that I've been analyzing and how these constructs can help us to design our strategies for stimulating people's behavior. So at the end, we see the framing for ocular arousal. Spatial scale is universal. Definition of entry route and wayfinding, juxtaposition of walls and shapes and forms. So from experience, we build the reality we live through our senses. This investigation aims to develop the descriptive system of new architectural interpretations and architectural design strategy. It is meant to function as a meticulous chart of tools supported by neuroscience. Sensory. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope for your questions and to see you soon. Thank you very much again.